In the develop panel, I usually start by setting things to auto. So I will take a look at the white balance. That's what this WB stands for. And I'm just going to put it to auto to see what happens. So you can see that Lightroom kind of warms up the image a little bit based on the overall tone of the image. If you are having trouble achieving what you think looks to be a normal white balance, you can always adjust the white balance with these sliders just by kind of clicking and dragging on them and seeing what happens. And you can increase the green or magenta point. You can increase the warmth or the coolness. I'm going to go back to auto. You can also use this eyedropper to select a neutral area of your picture. And so it's always handy to have like a white point or a neutral gray point in your image that you can select from. So if I wanted to do like a super custom white balance, I might select a point here on this whiteboard. And then it would give me even a little bit of a different setting than the auto setting. So if we look at auto, it's a little bit warmer. And if we go back to the custom eyedropper setting, it's a little bit cooler. I still prefer this warmer one just because I think it looks better with the model. So that's what I'm going to stick with. You can also just use this auto button here to set the tone. So this sets the exposure, the contrast, the highlights, shadows, etc. So let's just see what this does. Okay, so if I press auto, it brightens the image significantly. If we just take a quick look through these settings, we see the exposure is up by 0.33. And exposure typically goes up in blocks of 0.3. So an exposure of +1 would be extremely bright. You would see the highlights are beginning to kind of get really, really bright. And you can see that the shadows kind of increase in their tone as well. So you can see more of the shadows. So when you're experimenting with exposure, 0, of course, is like as it is from the camera. And you can start going up by increments of, say, 0.3, 0.6, 0.9, and just see what brightness you think works really well for the image. So in this case, the auto setting has selected 0.33. The contrast is the contrast between the bright and the dark areas. So if I lower the contrast, you see how the entire image takes on more of a muted tone. Whereas if I increase the contrast, it becomes really kind of sharp and intense. So good contrast is a balanced contrast. We don't want it to look too muted. We don't want it to look too intense either. So I'm going to kind of let it sit around 4 or 5. Highlights and shadows are a great way to control the intensity of brightness and darkness in your image. If you have a lot of contrast in your image and your highlights, let's say you're shooting this on a sunny day and sun was just pouring through the window and it was highlighting all of these white areas and making them really, really bright, you could use your highlight slider to decrease the brightness of those highlights. So everything that has a white tone to it will be kind of leveled down and modulated with this slider. And then you could simultaneously make the shadows brighter by increasing the shadow slider here. So this kind of shows us this dark area of the floor. Of course, this is a terrible image because it's just from a cell phone. But if this was a raw image, you would see that all the details from the shadows are brought up. I'm going to just put it back to auto again just to set it back. Whites and blacks is kind of a weird, similar thing to highlights and shadows, but whites basically means like the intensity of the whiteness itself. So if we bring this up, you can see the whites get super, super white and super bright. And the blacks, if we pull it down, they're going to get super, super black. So this is kind of like another way to control whites and blacks in your images. Okay. So then we have a whole bunch of other sliders down here. And for now, you don't really need to worry too much about them. The only one I usually use is clarity, and that tends to just give a little bit extra crispness to the image. So you might drag that up a tiny bit depending on the resolution of the camera you're using. And then I find that Lightroom tends to enjoy giving you extra vibrance and saturation, but I would be cautious with this. This tends to kind of oversaturate and over intensify the colors of an image. So I'm just going to bring that down to 5 and keep the saturation at 0. This is a model of white and black material, so I don't really care, first of all, that if there's like color vibrance, because I want to cut away all of the colors of the image anyways. But if you are working on images that do have colors, just be cautious that this doesn't get pumped up too high. A tone curve is another way of controlling the light and darks and colors within an image. This is a little bit more complicated. It takes some kind of experimentation to get a good tone curve going on, but generally what we look for in photography is a modulated S-curve. So we bring down the darks, the black, this side is all the darks, this side is all the lights, this is kind of the middle point. If we were to bring our middle point up here, it would kind of modulate the middle point of the entire image, and then the light and dark points would be balanced off of that. So this would be like a really intense dark image. If we bring this down, we have more of a balanced image. So if you don't want to fool around with the tone curve, that's totally fine. You can just reset it. You can just turn it off there if you've accidentally moved some of these curves, or just don't bother with it at all. So with the color sliders here, you might have yours show up like this. If you want to see it in a different way, just press on color. This is going to allow you to go through and set a whole bunch of options for each of these tones. So if I wanted to turn down the saturation of the orange tones, I would highlight orange, and then I would just drag my saturation all the way down. Or maybe I wanted to intensify those colors, in which case I would bring those up. You can also change the tone of these, the hue. So if I want my oranges to look a little more red, I would drag this slider towards the red zone. If I want them to look a little more yellow, I drag them towards the yellow zone. But I don't want to bother with any of this because these, again, are black and white images. Pretty much the rest of these we're going to leave except for lens corrections. Lightroom has a pretty extensive library of cell phones and point and shoot cameras and digital cameras. So if you just click on this Enable Profile Corrections, you can see that it finds my lens profile here. This is the camera I'm using, a Pixel 3. If you have an iPhone or any other type of phone that's pretty popular, it's very likely that Lightroom will have a setting for it. And this is just going to remove any lens distortions that are part of this camera. So if we turn this off, you see a very subtle effect in the middle of the frame where there's a little bit of barrel distortion. So this one is a little more pinched in, and then with the distortion adjustments, it gets a little bit pushed out. So this is always a good idea because certain phones will have, or certain cameras will have different levels of distortions. And so if you do have a profile that's available to you to use, definitely use it. If you don't have a profile available to use, you can always go to manual. And if you have a very visibly distorted image, I'm just going to go see if I can find something. Okay, let's say this has some barrel distortion. Barrel distortion is when the outer straight edges tend to bulge out. Pincushion distortion is when those edges tend to pull in. So let's say you have some barrel distortion. You can go into your distortion slider and just increase it or decrease it so that it makes sense with your vertical lines or horizontal lines. So you can see I'm kind of matching up this edge with the grid that's shown, and then I can go in later and straighten this out a little bit more using adjustments. But if you have a profile, just enable it and let Lightroom do the work for you. The final thing you might want to do is use adjustments to straighten the edges of your drawing or your model. So in this case, it's going to be tough to use auto because we don't have any kind of like upright elements in our picture. But what you can do is use these guided tools. So if I click on the guides, you can go in and you see how Lightroom kind of magnifies this area that I'm hovering over. And I can draw a line on this edge, right along the edge. And you need to have at least 2 lines in order for it to make an adjustment. So I will draw another one over here and match it up to this edge. And you see that Lightroom automatically adjusts it so that these are perfectly vertical. Let's try it here. If I want to set these as my horizontal points like that, and this is my horizontal point like that, then you see it, it automatically makes those parallel to each other. Now you could also say, well, this is also a parallel line, so I'm going to do that. The maximum number of lines in your drawing is 4. And usually it's 2 horizontals and 2 verticals. So you see that there was no further adjustment made after I added this line, and that is because you can't have, Lightroom doesn't read more than 2 parallel lines on the screen. So you can delete that and it doesn't make a difference. But if I was to draw this one as a vertical line, suddenly you would see how Lightroom adjusts this and distorts it to sort of look like it's in plan view. Now, this isn't actually in plan view, so we don't want that to happen. But if you are working in plan and you need to make adjustments to your drawing, then this is a good way to do it. All right, so I'm just going to go back to this and I'm going to click auto again just in case I messed anything up. And then I'm going to go in with my slider and just change a few of the settings just so that I making these like kind of little micro adjustments. The highlights a little bit down, shadows a little bit up. I'm going to take this back down to 5, 0. And then one easy way, if you want to like rotate your image easily, you can just hover over this crop overlay. And this is going to show you the rule of thirds grid that you have in your image. And it's going to allow you to hover over the edge and just like rotate it like that. So if I want to rotate mine a little bit like that and then just crop it in a bit, I can hold down Shift and it will constrain the proportions. And then I have a little bit of a rotation and a crop going on. So now that I have these settings, there's a couple things I could do if I want to apply them to all the rest. One thing I can do is select all the rest of the images, right click, go into develop settings and go paste settings from previous. And this is going to apply all of the exact same transformations and develop settings to the next group. However, just keep in mind that it may also do the same transformation adjustments. So if we look at, here, it says it's guided, which means it's using the guides from the original, and we don't want that. So I would just press off if you go through the photos and you notice that there are some distortions. So that's one way to do it. And I'm just going to undo all of that. Okay, now we're back to our original settings. This one is still edited. You could also create a preset. So I can go here, go create preset, and then I'm just going to call it model photos. You can choose a group to put it in. I have a whole bunch of different ones, so I'm just going to put it into architecture and landscape. And then you can check off which settings you want to copy over. So if you want to copy, all of these basic things, then you would just make sure those are all checked off. What I'm going to do is make sure that transform is unchecked because I don't want the lines, the guidelines that I've created for one image to be transformed and carried over into the next. I want to be able to do that individually. But I do want to carry over lens corrections and some of that stuff. Let's just see. Yeah, that looks good. So you can just go create. And then if you go down to your settings and you go to the next photo, you can just click model photos and it's going to apply those exact same settings as you had on your previous photo. Okay, I'm going to do it kind of the faster way and just go right click, develop settings, and paste settings from previous. And now all of them will have those settings applied to them. Now I can go through each individual photo and just see if there's any other adjustments I want to make. These ones are just reference photos for the presentation, so I don't need to worry about those. But with this is a plan photo, and the actual orientation of the plan is actually, this is the bottom and this is the top. So I'm going to go back into my library and I'm just going to rotate the image. I'm going to rotate the image here too so that it's oriented correctly. So now both my plans are in the right view. I will do that with this one too. This one is oriented correctly. This one needs to be rotated. Okay, now we can go back into develop. So with this one, I want to straighten it a little bit, and I might just do that with the rotate tool here. I'm just going to try to make it so that this line is straight. I kind of oriented that as a straight edge. So I'm going to do that. And then I think that this needs increased brightness, maybe to 1, lower contrast. I'm going to bring the whites up a little bit. And then I'm going to do an I'm going to do an eyedropper white balance here because I don't like that this creamy color is kind of overwhelming the model. I want it to be a little bit more neutral, so that looks much better. I'm still going to bring this up a little bit. I'm going to pull my saturation down. And then just because there's still some creaminess here, I'm just going to reduce the saturation of yellows and oranges and reds, just in case those are kind of hiding in these background tones. And then I can go into my crop overlay and select a crop ratio. So I'm going to select 1:1 because I want this to reflect my 50 centimeter by 50 centimeter approximate model. So I'm going to select that. And then I could say this is a great base for a plan to draw into Rhino. So if I think this is too closely cropped and I need a little bit more space, I might use the further out version. So another way you can copy settings over is to use Shift-Control-C. That will bring up this box where you can copy the settings from one to another. So I'm just going to select all of it, except I'm not going to allow the crop to be checked off. Copy that, bring it here, and then Shift-Control-V is the paste setting. So that gives me a similar look to the previous one. There's a little bit more contrast in the first, so I might just reduce this by a little bit, put it down to 1, and then bring up my contrast to 5. And then the only other thing I'm going to do is enable those profile corrections, and I'm going to use my guidelines to straighten out these edges. Like that. And now I'm going to crop it down to 1:1. So now I have two potential model views to choose from, depending on how much extra space I want around the model. Of course, yours will be a little bit more precise because you should have a base that's 50 by 50 centimeters. So it should be really easy for you to take those guidelines down in these transformation adjustments and sort of go along the edges and draw in the edges of your model. But because I didn't make a base for mine, I was just working with some sketch models. I'm just kind of estimating what my base would be like. So you can keep going through your images, and as long as you're in the develop panel, you can use, for example, the white balance adjustments if you want. You can increase the exposure or the contrast. You can darken the dark areas and lighten the light areas, or opposite. And you can kind of use the rotation and crop adjustment tools to modify the images to get somewhere where you like. Now, there's a few things you might want to do to actually make these look better. And those I think are better done in Photoshop. For example, if I wanted to clean up this area here and make it a little bit more smooth, I could do that in Photoshop. And then you can't add any extra assets to images in Lightroom. So the next step of this process, after you have gone through, processed your photos and decided on which images you want to bring forward, the next step would be to export these all as JPEGs. So I'm going to pretend that I'm done processing. I'm going to right click here and go export. Then I'm going to select my folder where I want to put the images. I'm going to choose model photos because that's where it is. And I'm just going to make a folder that says edited. I'll put those in there, and then I'm going to change the name to exercise 3 model photos. I'll start it at 1. I don't think these photos are going to be super huge, but I usually reduce the quality just to keep file sizes down. So I'm just going to keep it at 70. The image format is JPEG. That's totally fine. This is the normal color space for images. And then I can go hit export, and Lightroom will begin pumping those files back out into the folder. So if I then return to my model photos, I have my edited images, and now I have some images that I can work with going forward.